He said it before I had even opened the case file. Judge, let's be adults about this. You rule in my favor. I make sure this courthouse gets its renovation funding. You make this difficult, and I make sure it doesn't. He said it calmly, casually, like a man ordering coffee. Those words stopped every clock in my courtroom. Not because I hadn't heard arrogance before. After 30 years on this bench, I've heard all of it. But I had never, not once in 3 decades, had a sitting mayor walk through those doors and attempt to purchase a court ruling before a single piece of evidence had been placed before me. And the woman he was trying to push out of her life's work? She was 72 years old. She had opened her shop at 6 in the morning for 38 years and had never once received a complaint. Not one. If you believe the law should mean the same thing, regardless of who is standing in front of it. If you believe a woman who built something with her own hands deserves the same protection as any man in a bespoke suit, subscribe right now. Because what happened in my courtroom that Wednesday morning is something I believe everyone in this country needs to hear. It started as a routine morning. I was midway through the day's docket when the doors opened, and Mayor Conrad Briggs walked in. 54 years old, charcoal suit that hadn't come off a rack. 2 aides behind him, both typing on phones. A city attorney at his side, wearing the expression of a man who had spent the morning apologizing for someone and fully expected to spend the afternoon doing the same. Briggs didn't take a seat. He walked directly to the front of the room, dropped a folder on the table, checked his watch, and informed me, using a first-name familiarity he had not earned, that this matter should take 15 minutes and that I should consider the city's broader interests when reviewing the evidence. I removed my glasses and set them on the bench. On the other side of the aisle, sitting very straight in her chair, was Nora Pham, 72 years old, a cardigan she had worn to every important occasion of her adult life, hands folded carefully in her lap. She was looking at the bench with the composed, quiet expression of someone who is frightened and has decided, firmly decided, that showing it would cost her something she cannot afford to lose. Nora had run her alterations shop on the same corner of the same street for 38 years. She opened at 6 in the morning. She closed when the last customer was finished. Her shop was the kind of place people brought their wedding dresses and their father's old suits, and the clothes they wanted to keep just a little longer. 7 code violations had been filed against her shop in the previous 10 days. The man who had just checked his watch in my courtroom was the reason every single one of them existed. I called the case. Nora stood immediately, quietly, with the deliberateness of someone whose knees have developed opinions about cold mornings, but who stands anyway because she was taught that standing for the court means something. Mayor Briggs did not stand. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at me with the relaxed expression of a man attending a meeting whose outcome he has already decided. He used my first name, not Your Honor, not any form of address this courtroom requires, that every other person who has ever sat in that chair has managed without instruction. This should take 15 minutes, he said. I have a press conference at noon. I did not respond immediately. I set my glasses on the bench and waited. 6 seconds. 8. His attorney leaned close and whispered something urgent, the whisper of a man who has managed this personality long enough to know exactly how moments like this tend to go, and has run out of tools to prevent it. Briggs stood slowly, with the theatrical reluctance of a man performing inconvenience for an audience he believes owes him the performance. He straightened his jacket. Mayor Conrad Briggs, complainant. I'm here to make sure this court does what the city's code enforcement office has been trying to accomplish for the past 10 days. He turned slightly toward Nora, not quite pointing, but orienting toward her in the dismissive way you orient towards something you want removed. That business is a nuisance on a key development corridor. I'm here to see it handled properly. The gallery did not move, not a shuffle, not a whisper. In the back of the room, the courtroom camera's red light blinked steadily. The mayor thought he had walked into a formality. He was about to find out what he had actually walked into. He slid the folder across the table with the flat confidence of a man presenting something he considers self-explanatory. I opened it and read each violation carefully, not for the conclusions someone wanted me to reach, for what the documents actually said when you removed the official language and looked at what was underneath. Violation 1, a freight awning, no structural assessment, no engineering report, no measurement of deterioration, just the word frayed on a form with a checkbox beside it. Violation 2, signage exceeding permitted dimensions by 2 inches, measured by whom? Not specified. Using what instrument? Not specified. Violations 3 through 6, pedestrian obstruction and general maintenance concerns, each citing anonymous complaints. 4 of them submitted within the same 48-hour window by people whose names appeared nowhere in the record. I looked up. Mr. Calloway, the city's code inspector, had been sitting in the 3rd row, attempting the specific kind of stillness that people attempt when they are hoping not to be called upon. He was not successful. Did you personally observe each of the violations listed in this file? He stood. Yes, Your Honor. The flat delivery of a man reciting something he has been instructed to say rather than something he remembers doing. The awning, I said. Did you assess it as a structural risk, or did you assess it as visually worn? A pause longer than the question required. Visually worn. The sign. What instrument did you use to measure the 2-inch discrepancy? A longer pause. He described a process involving a measuring tape and an estimate. Can you name a single identified complainant from the 4 anonymous submissions? He could not. I closed the folder. The gallery had been silent since Briggs walked in, but this was a different quality of silence now. The silence of people who have just watched something that looked like documentation become something that looked like nothing. Then Briggs leaned forward. The investors cannot wait, he said, with the impatience of a man who has run out of patience for procedure. That's the reality of what we're dealing with. The room went very still, and I thought, there it is. I set the folder down. The investors cannot wait. I had been in this room for 30 years. I knew exactly what those 4 words meant when a sitting mayor said them in the context of a 72-year-old woman's business license. They meant the citations were not about the awning. They meant a development deal existed, that a corner was needed, and that the machinery of municipal code enforcement had been aimed at Nora Pham's shop the way you aim a tool at a specific job. I turned to Nora. Miss Pham, in the 38 years you have operated your shop on that corner, how many complaints or citations did you receive before this 10-day period? Her voice, when it came, was quiet, completely steady, the steadiness of someone who has been frightened and has decided that breaking would cost her something she cannot afford to lose. None, Your Honor, not one. I open at 6 in the morning. I close when the last customer is finished. I have never once been cited for anything, not in 38 years. The gallery absorbed that in silence. I looked at Mayor Briggs. Mayor Briggs, my voice was exactly where I keep it when the question I am about to ask is the only one that matters. If this shop belonged to your mother, if she had spent 38 years on that corner, opening at 6 in the morning, never once receiving a citation, would you have sent an inspector? He opened his mouth. I watched him search for something that would answer the question without answering it. Nothing came. The silence stretched across every corner of that courtroom. In the back, the camera's red light blinked steadily, recording everything. That silence was still sitting in the room when the courtroom doors opened. A man I did not recognize walked in, mid-40s, dark jacket, carrying a manila folder thick enough to make clear he had not assembled it quickly or casually. He moved with the purposefulness of someone who has spent time deciding whether to come forward and has finally decided. He approached the clerk's desk, identified himself quietly, and asked to be recognized by the court. Your name and your relation to this matter, I said. David Reyes, Your Honor. I own the print shop at 414 Clement Street, 2 doors from Nora's alterations. I'm a former city planning analyst. I have documentation I believe is relevant to these proceedings. He held up the folder. I submitted public records requests last week. These are the responses. I looked at Briggs. Something had shifted in his posture. Not dramatically, not yet, but in the small, specific way that posture shifts when a person recognizes something they did not expect to see in a room they believed they had controlled. I admitted David Reyes and asked him to present his documentation. He opened the folder with the methodical calm of a man who has worked with public records long enough to know that the facts inside them do not require embellishment. The development deal between the city and a private capital group had been signed 11 days before the first citation was filed against Nora's alterations. 11 days. The inspector who filed 6 of the 7 violations had been transferred to Nora's district the same week the development announcement was made. A transfer not requested by the inspector, with no documented operational justification. And there were emails. Internal city emails bearing the header of the mayor's office, directed to the division chief of code enforcement, instructing the division to document compliance issues on a specific block, not the corridor, not the district, the block. David Reyes had brought these findings to the city planning office 3 days earlier. He was told the matter was outside his scope. He came to my courtroom instead. I noted for the record that he had made the correct decision. I admitted the documentation. I noted David Reyes' testimony, and I began writing the order. That was when Mayor Briggs stood up, without being recognized, without waiting, without any of the procedural courtesies every other person in that room had managed without instruction. He used the words judicial overreach. He used politically motivated and procedural abuse and the legitimate development interests of this city's future. He pointed at David Reyes, at the folder, at me, with the specific aggression of someone who has spent a career in rooms where pointing worked. I let him finish every sentence. The complete version is almost always more useful than the interrupted one. When he stopped, I looked at him. Your outburst is noted for the record. Then I turned back to the order and continued writing. His attorney rose and produced a document. 3 pages, city letterhead. A legal opinion, he said, from the city's legal division, determining that a municipal judge's authority to refer evidentiary matters to the state attorney general's office required prior city council approval. He placed it on the clerk's desk with the careful movement of a man hoping the gesture reads as confidence. I took the document. I read it. Then I looked at him over my glasses. Who authored this opinion? He gave me a name from the city legal division. When was it filed with the city legal office? It had been prepared, he said, in anticipation of today's proceedings. Can you provide the filing reference number? A pause. He could not. Does this opinion appear in any public legal record of the city? A longer pause. It did not. A document prepared in anticipation of today's proceedings, authored by someone in an office controlled by the mayor, bearing no filing reference, appearing in no public record, produced at the precise moment the proceedings moved against the mayor's interests. I cited Mayor Conrad Briggs for direct contempt of court, the unrecognized outburst, the attempt to intimidate the proceedings, the submission of a document whose authenticity could not be established, 5 days in a county facility, a summary judgment executable immediately. Briggs stared at me. For one moment, just one, everything was simply gone. The performed confidence, the checked watch, the bespoke suit that hadn't come off a rack. What was underneath it was not what he had planned to show this courtroom today. The bailiff moved. Briggs was remanded. I dismissed all 7 violations, each one individually, on procedural and substantive grounds, with the specific deficiency of each citation noted in the record. I reinstated Nora Pham's business license effective immediately. I ordered all 7 citations expunged from her business record entirely. I referred the code enforcement process to the city ombudsman for review of potential abuse of process. And I referred the development documentation to the state attorney general's office for independent review. I signed the order and set down my pen. Nora sat very still in her chair. Her hands were still folded in her lap, but something in her face had changed. The careful composure she had been holding since she walked in that morning, the composure that had cost her something to maintain, was beginning to come apart at the edges, not in grief, in relief. The quiet, exhausted relief of someone who has been holding their breath for 10 days and has finally been told it's safe to breathe. David Reyes reached over and put his hand briefly on hers. She nodded once, just once. The courtroom footage was on the evening news before I had finished signing the remaining orders from that morning's docket. David Reyes's documentation reached the Attorney General's office by the following morning. The development deal, the timeline, the emails, the inspector's transfer. It became the lead story on every local broadcast by the end of the week. The city, which had been watching, began to understand what had almost been done on its behalf and in its name. 5 days later, the courtroom gallery was packed again, not with press this time, with people, shop owners from the development corridor, neighbors, several people who came forward to say that anonymous complaints had been submitted in their names without their knowledge or consent. Nora Pham sat in the front row in the same cardigan. David Reyes sat beside her. The side door opened. Mayor Conrad Briggs walked in wearing a county-issued gray jumpsuit. No aides, no attorney at his elbow. He hadn't shaved in 5 days. He walked to the table and stood there. And for the first time since he had arrived in this courtroom a week ago, he looked directly at Nora Pham. Not through her, not past her, at her. He told her that when he looked at her shop, he saw a corner, a location on a map, a line item in a development proposal. He told her he didn't see the 38 years. He didn't see the cardigan or the customers who brought their wedding dresses. He didn't see the woman who had built something with her own hands and kept it open through everything life had sent her way. He said he was sorry, not in the practiced cadence of a politician managing a narrative, but haltingly, brokenly, the way a man speaks when he has spent 5 days without his phone and his staff and his title, and has finally run out of ways to make what he did sound like something other than what it was. Nora looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded, once, quietly. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the acknowledgement of one human being who has decided, for now, to see another. It was, I thought, more than he had earned, and more than most people would have offered. Briggs was transferred to state investigators to face charges of abuse of office, procurement fraud, and interference with a civil proceeding. At the courtroom door, he stopped. He turned and looked back at the room. "I forgot what the job was supposed to be," he said quietly. Then he was gone. Nora and David walked out together. The shop opened at 6 the next morning, the way it always had. I have thought about that Wednesday many times since. I think about Nora Pham sitting in that chair, frightened, holding herself together, determined not to let it show. I think about the specific courage it takes to walk into a room where the most powerful person in your city has already decided your outcome, and to sit straight anyway. I think about David Reyes, who spent his own time and his own effort pulling public records together and walking through my courtroom doors, not because anyone asked him to, but because he thought it was the right thing to do. And I think about what almost happened, because I want to be clear about something. This is not a story about opposing growth or resenting ambition. Cities grow, corners change. Development is not the villain here. The villain is the instrument. What happens when the machinery of a city, its inspectors, its code office, its legal division, is quietly redirected away from its actual purpose and pointed at one woman's awning because a developer needs her corner and a mayor needs that developer's support? That is not governance. That is predation dressed in paperwork. Nora Pham never asked this courtroom for anything extraordinary. She asked to be subject to the same law as everyone else. That is not a special request. It is the only request this bench exists to honor. And here is what I want you to carry with you from this story. Justice doesn't protect itself. It doesn't happen automatically just because courtrooms exist, or laws are written, or judges put on robes in the morning. Justice happened in that courtroom because one woman refused to accept that her 38 years counted for less than a development proposal. Because one neighbor decided that walking through a courtroom door was worth the risk. Because documents existed that someone thought to ask for. And because a bench was prepared to read what was actually in the file, not what someone powerful wanted it to find there. That is how it works on the best days. That is how it has to work. If this story moved you, if it made you believe even for a moment that the law can still mean the same thing for the woman in the cardigan as it does for the man in the bespoke suit, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. The shop opens at 6. And this bench will be here when it does.